The cold in the cabin wasn't just from the autumn wind seeping through the chinks in the logs. It was the cold of a barren cupboard, the cold of a mother's fear. For 3 days, Sarah Hemlock had watched her children's faces grow gaunt, their laughter silenced by the gnawing ache in their bellies. She had nothing left, nothing but the ghosts of a happier time and a single thin band of gold on her finger. What would you do if the only thing you had left to sell was the memory of a love torn from you? For Sarah, the answer was waiting in the cold, hard eyes of a stranger, a lonely mountain man who looked like he'd forgotten what hope even felt like. The dust of Providence. Gulch clung to everything, a fine red powder that coated the hem of Sarah Hemlock's worn dress and settled in the lines of her face. It was a thirsty town, crouched in the shadow of the unforgiving Ruby Mountains, a place where dreams came to die, just as often as they were born. For Sarah, it had been the place where her life had shattered. Her cabin, a 2-day walk from the gulch, felt a world away now. In her mind's eye, she could see it clearly. The single room, the stone hearth, cold and black, the small, pale faces of her children, Thomas and Lily. Thomas, at 8 years old, was trying so hard to be the man of the house since his father Daniel was gone. He'd stopped asking for food yesterday, his pride a fragile shield against the hunger that cramped his small stomach. 5-year-old Lily had simply grown quiet, her usual chattering replaced by a listless stare. 3 days. 3 days since their last real meal, a handful of boiled potatoes. The memory spurred Sarah's feet forward, past the saloon where tinny piano music and rough laughter spilled out into the street, past the assayer's office, with its windows full of false promises. Her destination was the mercantile, but her purpose was not to buy. It was to wait. She knew of the man. Everyone in the gulch did, though few had ever spoken to him. Samuel Kane. He lived high up in the peaks, a trapper and hunter who came down to town only a few times a year, a ghost clad in buckskin with a pack horse laden with prime pelts. They said he'd lost a family to the fever years ago and had turned his back on the world of men. They said his heart was as hard and cold as the winter granite of his mountain. Sarah prayed they were wrong. She saw him as he was leaving the mercantile, a tall, gaunt figure with a beard the color of salt and ash. He moved with a quiet economy, loading sacks of flour, salt, and coffee onto his placid-looking pack horse. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, scanned the street with a wary indifference, the eyes of a predator who is never truly at rest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She clutched the small, precious object in her palm and stepped into his path. He stopped, not with a jolt, but with a fluid stillness. His gaze fell upon her, and for a moment Sarah felt pinned like a moth to a board. There was no curiosity in his eyes, only a flat, weary annoyance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting deep underground. It was not an invitation to speak. It was a dismissal. "Mr. Kane," she began, her voice trembling despite her resolve. She forced it steady. "My name is Sarah Hemlock. I need to ask you something." He said nothing, simply watched her, his face, an unreadable mask of weathered skin and beard. Sarah took a shaky breath and opened her hand. Lying in her palm was a simple, thin gold band. It was worn smooth from the 6 years she had worn it, but it still caught the harsh afternoon sun. Daniel's ring, her wedding band. "My kids," she said the words, catching in her throat. "My kids haven't eaten in 3 days. I have nothing left to sell. Nothing but this. The mercantile owner, Mr. Peterson, he'd give me pennies for it just to melt it down. But it's worth more. It's good gold. I was hoping you might buy it. For a fair price, just enough for flour bacon. Some beans." Samuel Kane's eyes dropped from her face to the ring in her hand, then back to her face. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. She could feel the stares of passers-by, the judgment of the townspeople who saw only another widow failing to make her way. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but something darker, something that looked like a deep, ancient pain. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind that cold indifference. "I don't trade in trinkets," he said, his voice flat. He turned back to his horse, adjusting a strap on the pack saddle, his movements deliberate, final. Desperation, sharp and acidic, clawed at Sarah's throat. "Please," she whispered the word, a ragged breath. "You don't understand. Their names are Thomas and Lily. They're just babies." He paused, his back still to her. For a heartbeat, she thought he might turn, might reconsider. When he spoke again, his voice was even colder than before. "Everyone's got a story, Mum. The mountains don't care. The winter don't care. A man learns to only carry his own burdens." He gave the strap a final tug, and without another look in her direction, took the reins of his horses and began to lead them down the dusty street, away from her, away from the town, back toward the silence of his lonely peaks. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still outstretched, the ring seeming to burn a hole in her palm. The weight of it was no longer the weight of love and memory, but the crushing weight of failure. The town's hardest heart had proven to be just as hard as the stories claimed. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful, blurring the sight of the mountain man's retreating back. She had failed. Her children would go hungry again tonight. The trail leaving Providence Gulch was a winding scar of packed earth that climbed steadily into the foothills of the Ruby Mountains. For Samuel Kane it was a familiar path, a cleansing ritual that washed away the stink and noise of civilization. He preferred the language of the wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk, the silent passage of a deer through the underbrush. The world of men was a tangle of needs and sorrows he had cut himself free from long ago. Or so he had told himself. But as his sturdy mountain horse Boulder picked its way over the rocky ground, Samuel found no peace. The woman's face was seared into his mind. Sarah Hemlock. He didn't know the name, but he knew the look in her eyes. It was the hollowed-out look of a soul worn down to its very last nerve, the look of a cornered animal willing to do anything to protect its young. He'd seen that look once before, in a mirror. He gritted his teeth, urging Boulder to a faster pace, as if he could outrun the memory. But the memory was a tireless rider, and it galloped alongside him. He saw a small, rough-hewn cabin, much like the one the woman must have. He smelled the cloying, sweet scent of sickness. He saw the face of his wife Mary, her skin pale as milk, her breath coming in shallow rasps. And he saw his son, little Jacob, his small body consumed by the same fever that was taking his mother. The winter of 71, the red cough they'd called it. It had swept through the lower valleys like a wildfire. He had been helpless. He Samuel Kane, a man who could track a wolf for 3 days in a blizzard, who could read the land like a book, who could survive where other men perished, had been utterly and completely helpless. He had held Mary's hand as the light faded from her eyes, and 2 days later he had buried his son beside her on a cold, wind-swept hill. After that, he had turned his back on the world. He had climbed into the high peaks where the air was thin and clean, where the only sorrows were his own. He had made a vow on their graves he would never again be tangled in the lives of others. He would never again be made to feel so powerless. A man learns to only carry his own burdens. He had meant every word. But the woman's voice echoed in the canyon of his memory. Their names are Thomas and Lily. They're just babies. He cursed under his breath, a harsh, guttural sound. It was not his concern. The West was full of widows and orphans. It was the natural, brutal order of things. Her husband, whoever he was, should have provided better. He should have been stronger or smarter or luckier. Life was a cruel accounting, and some debts could never be paid. He rode on for another hour, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The air grew colder. He should have been thinking about making camp, but his mind was still back in the dusty street of the gulch. My kids haven't eaten in 3 days. Damn her. Damn her for having the courage to approach him. Damn her for making him remember. He saw Jacob's face, not as it was in sickness, but as it was in life, bright, curious, his small hand clutching Samuel's finger. He remembered the gnawing fear he'd felt when their stores had run low that final winter, the desperate hunting trips that had yielded nothing. He had known that same cold dread that he had seen in Sarah Hemlock's eyes. He reined Boulder to a sudden halt. The pack horse bumped into him from behind, jingling its harness in protest. For a long moment, Samuel sat motionless, a statue of buckskin and leather silhouetted against the dying light. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying a scent of snow from the highest peaks. It was the smell of solitude, the smell of his chosen life. He thought of the sacks of flour on his pack horse, the slab of bacon wrapped in oilcloth, the bag of beans. It was more than enough to last him through the first snows. It was a fortune to a starving family. With another curse, this one aimed at his own softening heart, he pulled sharply on Boulder's reins, turning the horse around in the narrow trail. The animal snorted, confused by the change of direction. "Easy boy," Samuel muttered, his voice hoarse. "Seems we left something behind." He wasn't buying her ring. He wouldn't be drawn in. He would give her some supplies, enough to see her through the week. A simple act of charity, nothing more. He would drop the food, turn around, and ride back to his mountain without a word. He would not ask her name again. He would not learn the names of her children. He would be an anonymous act of God, a fleeting moment of fortune in her desperate life. Then he would retreat back to his fortress of solitude, the transaction complete, his vow of non-involvement, bruised but not broken. As he urged his horses back down the trail toward Providence Gulch, the setting sun cast his long shadow before him. He rode with a grim determination, a man at war with himself, trying to convince his own heart that this wasn't an act of compassion, but merely a way to silence the ghosts that a desperate woman had unwittingly awakened. By the time Samuel found her homestead, dusk had bled across the sky, leaving a bruised purple twilight in its wake. A local in town, a liveryman who owed Samuel a favor, had given him the grudging directions. "The old Hemlock place," he'd called it. "Out by Whisperin' Creek. Poor woman's had nothing but bad luck since Daniel died in the mine collapse." The cabin was even smaller and more dilapidated than Samuel had imagined. It leaned to one side like a tired old man, and the smoke, rising from the chimney, was thin and pale, a sign of a meager fire fighting a losing battle against the encroaching night. A dim, flickering orange light glowed in the single window. He dismounted quietly, leaving the horses tied to a low-hanging pine branch. He pulled a sack of flour from his pack horse, grabbed the bacon and a bag of beans, and walked toward the door. He would leave them on the stoop knock once and be gone before she could open it. A clean break. But as he approached, he heard a man's voice from inside. It wasn't the voice of a neighborly visitor. It was low and slick, with an undercurrent of menace that made the hairs on Samuel's neck stand on end. "Sarah, you are being unreasonable," the voice said, oozing a false patience. "It's a generous offer. More than this worthless scrap of land is worth. Sign the deed and your troubles are over. $100. Think of what you could do with that. Take your children. Get a room in town. Start fresh." Samuel froze, melting back into the shadows of the pines. He moved silently to the side of the cabin, near the window, his hunter's instincts taking over. "It is not worthless to me, Mr. Corbin," Sarah Hemlock's voice replied. It was stronger now, laced with a weary defiance. "It is all my Daniel left us. It is our home. Daniel is dead," the man named Corbin snapped his voice, losing its veneer of civility. "He died because he was careless in my mine. I owe you nothing. This offer is charity, a testament to my good nature. $100, Sarah, or you can stay here and starve. Winter is coming. That roof won't hold the snow, and you have no man to fix it. What will you do then? What will your children eat when the ground is frozen solid?" Through a grimy pane of glass, Samuel could see the scene inside. Sarah stood by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around her two small children who clung to her skirts. Facing them was a man whose expensive suit and polished boots were an affront to the poverty of the cabin. He was portly and balding, with a face that was soft and cruel at the same time. Samuel recognized him, Bartholomew Barth Corbin. He owned the Silver Crown mine, the saloon, and half the businesses in Providence Gulch. He was the spider at the center of the town's web. "I will not sell," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm as iron. Corbin let out an exasperated sigh. "I will be back in 2 days, with the town marshal. You are squatting on land for which the taxes have not been paid. I've already spoken to Judge Miller. He agrees the property should be auctioned. I will get this land, Sarah. The only question is whether you walk away with $100 in your pocket or with nothing at all." He turned and strode toward the door. Samuel stepped back from the window, flattening himself against the log wall, his hand resting on the hilt of the large hunting knife sheathed at his belt. The door creaked open, and Corbin stepped out, adjusting his coat. He didn't see Samuel in the deep shadows. He walked a few paces from the cabin and paused, looking back with a venomous expression. He muttered to himself, but in the stillness of the evening, Samuel heard him clearly. "Stubborn fool. He should have just told you where the spring was, Daniel. Would have saved us all this trouble." Corbin marched off into the darkness, toward a horse and buggy Samuel hadn't noticed before. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. The spring. Samuel knew this land. Water was more valuable than gold in this dry country. A reliable year-round spring could make a man rich, and Corbin's mention of her dead husband, Daniel, was chillingly familiar. The mountain man waited until the sound of the buggy faded before he moved. His plan to drop the food and leave was gone, burned away by the injustice he had just witnessed. He walked to the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet night. The door opened a crack and Sarah's frightened face appeared. When she saw him, her expression shifted from fear to utter confusion. "Mr. Kane, ma'am," he said, his voice gruff. He thrust the sacks into her hands. "Figured you could use this more than I could." She stared at the flour, the bacon, the beans, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But my ring. I don't have enough." "It's not a trade," Samuel cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. He didn't want thanks or tears. "I saw that man leaving. Corbin." Her face hardened. "He wants our land," I heard Samuel said. He looked past her to the two children peeking out from behind her legs. The boy, Thomas, watched him with wide, solemn eyes. The little girl, Lily, hid her face. in her mother's dress. He saw the ghost of his own son in the boy's defiant stare. He felt a pull, a dangerous, unfamiliar sense of responsibility. He had come here to silence his ghosts, but instead he had found them living in this ramshackle cabin. He said he's coming back in 2 days. With the marshal, Samuel stated watching her face. Panic flickered in her eyes, but she held her ground. "I'll find a way." Samuel looked at the sagging roof, the ill-fitting door, the palpable poverty of the place. She wouldn't find a way. Corbin would crush her. And for a reason, Samuel couldn't explain a reason, that felt like a betrayal of his own long-held vows, he found. He could not allow that to happen. "Your husband, Samuel," said the words, feeling strange on his tongue. "Daniel. He died in Corbin's mine." Sarah nodded, clutching the sacks of food to her chest as if they were treasure. "A timber gave way. A terrible accident," they said. Samuel thought of Corbin's muttered words. "He should have just told you where the spring was, Daniel." It didn't sound like an accident. It sounded like a motive. Mom, Samuel said, making a decision that would unravel the careful solitude he had built for a decade. "I'm a fair hand with an axe. That roof needs mending before the first snow. And your wood pile is low. I'll stay the night. In the morning I'll fix the roof and chop you some wood. We can talk more about Corbin then." Sarah stared at him, speechless. The feared, heartless mountain man who had refused to buy her wedding ring hours earlier was now offering to fix her roof and protect her from the most powerful man in the county. It made no sense. But as she looked into his pale, weary eyes, she saw something that had been absent before. Not pity, but a flicker of grim, unyielding purpose. Why, she finally whispered. Samuel looked away from her toward the dark, looming shapes of the mountains. "Let's just say I don't like seeing a wolf circling the sheep pen," he said. "Now get those children fed." The morning broke cold and clear the sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue. The smell of frying bacon, a scent Sarah hadn't smelled in months, filled the small cabin. For the first time in a long time, she had watched her children eat until their bellies were full. Lily had chattered endlessly, her energy restored, while Thomas had eaten in a quiet, serious way, occasionally glancing over at the strange, silent man who sat by the fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. Samuel Kane had not slept in the cabin. He'd refused her offer of a blanket by the hearth, choosing instead to sleep outside, rolled in his own bedroll near the woodpile, as if he were more comfortable with the cold stars than a warm roof. After the meager breakfast, Sarah brought him a tin cup of hot coffee. He took it with a nod, his hands calloused and scarred, swallowing the bitter liquid in 3 long gulps. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For the food. For everything." "The roof," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble as he stood up, all business. "I'll need to see what wood you have." As he worked, Sarah felt a strange sense of security she hadn't felt since Daniel died. Samuel moved with a quiet competence, wasting no motion. He tested the rotting timbers of the roof with a critical eye, his powerful shoulders felling a dead pine with a dozen swings of his axe, his hands shaping the new supports with a skill that spoke of years of self-reliance. Thomas watched him, mesmerized. After a while, Samuel noticed the boy's silent attention. "Want to learn how to split a log, boy?" Samuel asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. Thomas nodded eagerly. For the next hour, Samuel showed him how to stand, how to hold the smaller axe where to aim. He didn't coddle him, but he was patient. Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart aching. It was the first time she had seen her son, with a man who could teach him how to be one since Daniel was gone. Later, as Samuel took a break, she gathered her courage. "You asked about my husband," she began, sitting on a stump near where he was resting. Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. Corbin mentioned him. Seemed personal. "I don't know why," Sarah confessed, twisting a loose thread on her apron. "Daniel was a good miner. Quiet. Kept to himself. He worked for Corbin for 2 years. He always said Corbin was a cheat, that he would find a way for us to be free of him." She paused, her voice dropping. "He said he had a secret. Something that would set us up for life, get us our own land, a real ranch. He was going to tell me what it was the night he died." Samuel's head turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "A secret, yes. He said it was something right under Corbin's nose. Something about this land, this very plot. He said people thought it was just worthless rock and scrub, but that it held a treasure. I thought he meant he'd found a small vein of silver, something he could mine himself." Samuel thought of Corbin's words again. The spring. It wasn't silver. It was water. "Your wedding ring," he said suddenly. "May I see it, Woosod?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before slipping it from her finger. She had put it back on after her failed attempt to sell it, the familiar weight a small comfort. She handed it to him. Samuel turned the small gold band over in his thick fingers. It looked tiny and delicate in his hand. "Where did you get this?" "Daniel had it made," she said. "By an old prospector in the next county, a man named Peter MacLeod. He was a jeweler in his younger days. Daniel said he was the only one he trusted to work with pure gold." Samuel squinted, holding the ring up to the light. On the inside of the band, almost completely worn away, was a tiny inscription. It was barely a scratch. He ran his thumb over it. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. "Where the creek whispers." Samuel read aloud, his voice low. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Whispering Creek. That's what Daniel called the little stream that runs through the back of our property. He said, if you sat by it at night, the way the water ran over the rocks sounded like it was whispering secrets." She looked at Samuel, her eyes wide, with a dawning, fearful understanding. "What does it mean?" "It means your husband was smart." Samuel said, a grim respect in his tone. He didn't trust Corbin. He didn't write his secret down on a piece of paper that could be found. He put it somewhere he knew you would always keep safe. He handed the ring back to her. "This isn't just a piece of jewelry, Ma'am. I think it's a map." He stood up and walked toward the back of the property, Sarah following close behind. The creek was little more than a trickle, a shallow stream weaving through rocks and hardy mountain shrubs. To most, it would be insignificant. "Corbin's not after this land for the timber or for grazing," Samuel explained, his eyes scanning the landscape. "He's after it for the water. A year-round spring in these parts. A man who controls everything. He can sell the water to the town, to the other ranchers. He can deny it to his enemies. Your husband found the source, the head of the spring, and he knew its value. They followed the creek for 1/2 mile deeper into the rocky, scrub-covered land. The whispering of the water grew slightly louder as the small canyon narrowed. "The accident in the mine," Samuel said, thinking aloud. "Corbin said Daniel was careless. I'm betting he wasn't. I'm betting Daniel told Corbin he'd found something valuable and wanted a fair share. Corbin refused, so Daniel kept the location a secret, and Corbin decided he'd rather have the whole prize to himself." A cold dread settled in Sarah's stomach. You think Corbin killed him?" "Men like Corbin don't leave loose ends," Samuel said grimly. "A deliberately weakened support beam, a small, well-placed charge of dynamite. It would be easy to make it look like an accident, especially when you own the mine and pay the wages of every man who would investigate. They stopped where the creek seemed to emerge from a jumble of massive boulders and dense thicket. It looked impassable, but Samuel, with his trapper's eye, saw what an ordinary person would miss: a faint game trail leading into the thicket, a few broken branches, a scuff mark on a rock that was not natural. "He came here often," Samuel murmured. "This is the place." He looked at Sarah, his expression hard. "Corbin thinks the secret of the spring died with your husband. He's trying to scare you off the land before you can find it. What he doesn't know is that Daniel left you one last message." He looked from the creek back to her face, and for the first time she saw a fire in his eyes that wasn't born of pain or solitude, but of a cold, gathering rage. "And we're going to find it." Samuel worked his way into the dense thicket with the quiet patience of a man who understood the wilderness. He moved brush aside his eyes, scanning the ground, the rocks, the very way the light fell. Sarah followed her heart, pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The air grew cooler and smelled of damp earth and stone. Behind the wall of boulders and overgrown hawthorn, it was like stepping into another world. A small hidden grotto opened up before them, no bigger than the inside of her cabin. Moss grew thick and green on the rocks, and ferns clung to the damp crevices, and there, bubbling up from a fissure in the rock, was the source of Whisper Creek. It wasn't a trickle. It was a steady, clear, and vibrant flow of pure water, pooling into a small, deep basin before spilling out to form the creek. It was a source of life, a liquid treasure hidden in plain sight. "He found it," Sarah breathed, her voice filled with awe and sorrow. This was his secret. This is what Corbin would kill. For Samuel corrected her grimly. His gaze wasn't on the water, but on the walls of the grotto. The ring said, "Where the creek whispers." This is where it's born. But Daniel was a smart man. He'd have left more. Some proof. Something to use against Corbin. He began to run his hands over the rock face, near the spring, testing for loose stones, searching for anything out of place. Sarah joined him, her own hands tracing the cool, damp surfaces. It felt like she was touching the last thing her husband had ever touched. For several minutes they searched in silence, the only sound the gurgle of the newborn creek. Here Samuel said his voice, low. His fingers had found a small, flat rock, wedged unnaturally into a crevice just above the waterline. He worked it loose with the tip of his knife. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. Reaching inside, Samuel pulled out a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. His fingers, surprisingly nimble for their size, unwrapped the package. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal and a folded piece of paper. He handed the journal to Sarah. Her hands trembled as she took it. It was Daniel's. She recognized his neat, compact handwriting. She opened it to the last few entries. October 14th, 1881. Corbin knows I've found something. He's been watching me. The greed drips off him like sweat. He offered me a pittance for the location, $100, as if I am a fool. This spring is worth 1,000 times that. It is our future. Sarah's and the children's. I told him I would consider it, but I will never give it to him. I will file the claim myself with the Territorial Land Office next month. October 16th, 1881. I have hidden the survey map and my copy of the water rights application in the grotto. Corbin is pushing me, asking questions about my section of the mine. He put me on the new Western Tunnel, alone. Says it's a privilege. I don't like it. It feels isolated. If anything happens to me, it is Corbin's doing. I have marked the weak timber he refuses to replace. It is a death trap. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. The last entry was dated the day before he died. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. This journal was the proof. Samuel, meanwhile, had unfolded the other paper. It was a hand-drawn map of Sarah's property, meticulously surveyed with the location of the spring clearly marked. At the bottom was a notarized stamp from a circuit magistrate and the beginnings of a formal application for sole water rights. Daniel had been one step away from securing their future. He had him killed, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. That monster killed him and left us to starve on the very land he was trying to steal. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He did, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. But he made a mistake. He underestimated your husband, and he underestimated you. He took the journal and the map from her, rewrapping them carefully in the oilcloth. This changes everything. This is more than just a property dispute now. This is proof of murder. They made their way back to the cabin in a somber silence, the weight of their discovery heavy in the air. The children were playing near the front door, their brief moment of happiness a stark contrast to the dark truth their mother now carried. When they reached the cabin, Samuel stopped her before she went inside. Corbin said he'd be back tomorrow. He said, his face hard as granite. He'll come expecting to find a broken woman ready to sign away her home for a pittance. He's not going to expect to find me. And he's certainly not going to expect us to have this. He patted the bundle tucked inside his buckskin shirt. What will we do? Sarah asked, looking up at him. She was no longer just a desperate widow. She was a woman whose husband had been stolen from her, and a cold fire of anger was beginning to burn away her fear. Tonight I'll watch, Samuel said. Corbin is not a patient man. He might not wait. Tomorrow we don't go to the town marshal. Marshal Thompson is a good man, but he's weak and Corbin owns him. We go straight to the circuit judge when he comes through next week. But first we need to make sure Corbin can't get his hands on this proof or on you and your children. He looked at her small, vulnerable homestead, then at the vast, protective wilderness that was his home. He thinks he has you trapped here, Samuel said, but your husband knew this land was your strength. Corbin is about to find out just how strong it is. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a promise. Justice was coming to Providence Gulch, and the lonely mountain man was going to be the one to deliver it. Night fell like a black velvet shroud over the small homestead. Inside the cabin, Sarah put the children to bed, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a newfound steely resolve. Lily and Thomas, full-bellied and tired, fell asleep, quickly oblivious to the storm gathering around their home. Outside, Samuel was a ghost in the darkness. He did not build a fire. He moved around the perimeter of the property, his senses on high alert. He noted every rock, every tree that could provide cover. He checked the sight lines from the road. He was not a trapper tonight. He was a sentinel. He had tucked Daniel's journal and the map safely inside a hollow log far from the cabin. The proof was safe. Now he had to keep the family safe. He settled behind a cluster of boulders that overlooked the path to the cabin, his long rifle resting across his lap. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the creek that had given them their hope. It was just after midnight when he heard it. Not the sound of a single buggy, but the soft thud of multiple horses, their riders trying and failing to be silent. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Corbin hadn't waited, and he hadn't come to talk. 3 figures on horseback materialized out of the gloom, dismounting 100 yards from the cabin. Samuel could just make out their shapes. One was stout Corbin. The other 2 were leaner, moving with the coiled readiness of hired guns. He recognized them from town, the Miller brothers, Frank and Jesse men, who would do anything for a fistful of dollars. "Burn it!" Corbin's voice hissed, carrying on the still night air. "Burn it to the ground. If she and the brats are inside, so be it. An accident, a tragic fire. The whole town will weep for her." A cold fury, colder than any mountain winter, settled over Samuel. He had lived his life by a simple code: leave the world alone, and it would leave him alone. Corbin had just broken that code. "Frank, you take the back," Corbin ordered. "Jesse, you're with me. Let's get this over with." Samuel raised his rifle, the smooth wooden stock familiar against his cheek. He was not a murderer. He would not fire the first lethal shot, but he would end this. As Jesse Miller approached the cabin, a torch in his hand, Samuel aimed for the flaming brand. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, the sound shattering the night silence. The torch exploded in a shower of sparks, and Jesse cried out, dropping it and clutching his hand. "What in the hell?" Corbin yelled, diving for cover behind a shallow ditch. "Someone's out there!" Frank Miller shouted from the back of the cabin. "It's that damned mountain man," Corbin growled. "He's still here. Take care of him. $50 each." A muzzle flash erupted from behind the cabin, and a bullet whizzed past Samuel's head, chipping a piece of rock that stung his cheek. Frank Miller was a good shot. Samuel didn't stay put. He melted away from the boulders circling through the darkness with a speed and silence that defied his size. He was in his element now. The darkness and the rough terrain were his allies. The Miller brothers were town dogs. He was a wolf. He heard them moving, crashing through the brush, trying to flush him out. He let them come closer, their boots crunching on dry leaves. When Frank Miller passed a large pine tree, Samuel stepped out from behind it. He didn't use his rifle. He slammed the heavy stock into the back of Miller's head. The man grunted and collapsed without a sound. One down. From inside the cabin, the light of the single lamp was extinguished. Sarah. She was smart. She was keeping her head down. "Jesse, where are you?" "See him," Corbin's panicked voice called out. "Can't see nothin'." Jesse called back, his voice shaky. He fired his pistol wildly into the darkness, the shots echoing through the small valley. Samuel used the sound to pinpoint Jesse's location near the corner of the woodpile. He picked up a stone and tossed it to his left. It landed in a bush with a loud rustle. Jesse spun and fired at the sound. In that instant, Samuel closed the distance. He tackled Jesse Miller from the side, a brutal driving impact that sent the gunman's pistol flying. They rolled on the ground, a chaos of limbs and curses. Jesse was strong, but Samuel was powered by a righteous fury. He landed a single solid punch to the man's jaw. Jesse went limp. 2 down. Now there was only Corbin, who was cowering in the ditch, his fancy suit covered in dirt. Miller's report. Corbin yelled, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind and the whispering creak. A tall, dark shape rose from the blackness, not 10 feet in front of him. It was the mountain man. In the faint starlight, Samuel Kane looked less like a man, and more like an avenging spirit of the mountain itself. His rifle was held loosely in one hand. Corbin fumbled for his own small pistol, a silver-plated derringer. "Stay back," he squeaked. "I'm a respected man." "You can't." Samuel crossed the distance in 2 long strides and kicked the pistol from Corbin's hand. He reached down, grabbed a fistful of Corbin's expensive coat, and hauled the portly man out of the ditch as if he were a sack of grain. "It's over." Corbin Samuel's voice was a low, chilling whisper. "You wanted this land. You murdered a good man for it. You were willing to murder his wife and children. Now you're going to answer for it." He dragged the sputtering, terrified man toward the cabin. The door opened, and Sarah stood there, a shotgun held steady in her hands. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her eyes were blazing. "Tie him to the porch post," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. As Samuel secured Corbin with a length of rope from his saddle, the mine owner found his bluster again. "You'll hang for this, both of you, assaulting a town benefactor. The marshal will listen when the circuit judge reads." "Daniel Hemlock's journal," Samuel said coldly. "The one where he names you as his future murderer." The color drained from Bartholomew Corbin's face. He stared at Samuel, then at Sarah, and in the ruins of his arrogance, there was only the pathetic naked fear of a man whose sins had finally come home to roost. The siege at Whisper Creek was over. The arrival of Circuit Judge Abraham Reed in Providence Gulch a week later was an event. He was a stern, unsmiling man with a reputation for incorruptibility that even Bartholomew Corbin's money couldn't tarnish. He listened in his makeshift courtroom in the town hall. His fingers steepled his eyes, missing nothing. Samuel Kane stood before him, not as an accuser, but as a witness. He spoke in a clear, steady voice, recounting the events factually without emotion. He presented Daniel Hemlock's journal and the survey map. He described Corbin's late-night visit with the Miller brothers, who were now sitting in the town jail, all too willing to testify against their former employer in exchange for leniency. Then Sarah Hemlock took the stand. She did not weep. She spoke of her husband, of his dreams, and of the secret he had entrusted to her in the inscription on her wedding ring. She held up the ring for the judge to see. Her voice filled with a quiet, powerful grief, and an unshakable dignity held the entire courtroom spellbound. When it was all laid bare, Judge Reed's verdict was swift and absolute. Bartholomew Corbin was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, and a dozen other charges. His assets, including the Silver Crown mine, were to be seized. He would be transported to the territorial prison to serve a life sentence of hard labor. The reign of the Spider of Providence Gulch was over. The judge also made a final ruling. The water rights to the Whisper Creek Spring are hereby awarded in full to Mrs. Sarah Hemlock and her heirs, as was the clear intent of her late husband, Daniel Hemlock. Furthermore, the deed to her property is affirmed with all back taxes, forgiven in light of the criminal actions taken against her. A quiet murmur of approval went through the courtroom. For the first time in a long time, justice had been served in the Gulch. In the days that followed, the world changed for Sarah Hemlock. She was no longer the pitiful widow. She was the woman who had stood up to Barth Corbin and won. She owned the most valuable resource in the county. Ranchers who had once ignored her now came to her hats in hand, offering fair prices to water their herds. The town, free of Corbin's oppressive thumb, began to feel like it could breathe again. Samuel helped her through it all. He helped her draft the water contracts. He repaired the rest of the cabin, making it sturdy and warm. He taught Thomas how to hunt and fish, and he carved a small wooden bird for Lily, who now followed him everywhere. The silence that had once clung to him like a shroud was now filled with the sounds of children's laughter. One evening, as the sun set, painting the Ruby Mountains in hues of rose and gold, Sarah found him sitting on the porch looking up at his peaks. His pack horse was saddled. A cold knot of fear formed in her stomach. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, not looking at her. "The snow will be coming to the high country soon." "Time I was getting back." "You have a home here, Samuel," she said softly. "You know that." He was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the distance. "My home is up there," he said, his voice quiet, "with my memories. Mary, Jacob. I made a vow." "You honored their memory by what you did here," Sarah countered, stepping closer. You saved a family, just like you probably wish someone could have saved yours. Maybe your vow wasn't about being alone. Maybe it was about being strong enough to not be helpless again. You weren't helpless this time, Samuel. He finally turned to look at her. In his pale blue eyes, she saw the storm of a decade of grief and solitude warring with a fragile, newfound warmth. I don't know how to be anything else. Sarah, he confessed, his voice thick with a vulnerability she had never heard. She reached out and gently took his large, calloused hand. On her finger, her wedding ring gleamed in the last light of day. It was no longer a symbol of just a past love lost, but of a future that had been miraculously reclaimed. Then let us teach you, she said. Stay. Stay and see the spring through. Stay and watch my son become the man you're teaching him to be. Stay. For us. Samuel looked at her hand in his, then at her face, her eyes full of a strength and hope he thought had vanished from the earth. He looked at the warm light glowing from the cabin window, where 2 children were safe and fed. He looked up at his cold, lonely mountain, and then back at the small, vibrant family before him. Slowly, deliberately, he untied the reins of his pack horse and let them fall to the ground. A small, weary smile touched his lips for the first time. All right, Sarah, he said, his voice a low rumble of surrender. I'll stay for the spring. But as she smiled back, a brilliant, beautiful smile that chased the last of the shadows from his heart, he knew, and she knew that he would be staying for much, much longer than that. The story of Sarah Hemlock and Samuel Cain reminds us that even in the harshest wilderness, a single act of reluctant compassion can change everything. It's a testament to the fact that our deepest wounds don't have to be our final chapter. Samuel sought solitude to escape his ghosts, but he only found peace when he chose to face the sorrows of another. Sarah, armed with nothing but a mother's love and the memory in a gold ring, found the strength to reclaim not just her home but her future. Their journey shows us that true strength isn't about carrying our burdens alone, but about having the courage to help someone else carry theirs. If this story of resilience, justice, and the healing power of human connection moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a story of hope against all odds. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the Old West that prove that even in the dust and the desperation, goodness can find a way to take root and grow. Thank you for listening.